This video is for Chapter 2 of your gender textbook. Chapter 2 is entitled Ideas, and it introduces the concept of the binary as well as gender ideology. In addition, I will be introducing the concepts of hegemonic masculinity and emphasize femininity when we talk about gender expression. To get us started, and this is an activity that I often do in my in-person classes, but if you haven't already done so, jot down 5 personality traits that you think best describe you. So would you describe yourself as kind or brave or conscientious or creative or generous or you get my point. Loyal, right? Just think about the kind of personality characteristics that you use to describe yourself and just jot it down somewhere. I promise that I will come back to this thought exercise later in this lecture video to illustrate a point. To begin us thinking about this concept of ideas and the idea of there being a gender binary, that we are two distinct genders with non-overlapping traits and characteristics, right? That there is this high level of differentiation that exists between the sexes. I want to give 3 examples, and I'm going to be honest, I did not think of these examples on my own. In previous semesters, there was a small little reader that used to be included as a bundle with the first edition of your textbook. And I used to assign it in my classes and some of the readings that went along with the textbook. The reader is no longer in print, and it's fairly scarce and hard to find. So that's why I'm not assigning it, this semester. But in the reader, in order to introduce this part, the introduction to ideas, these were the examples that they gave. And so I still think they're very good examples and things to think about. So example 1, they said, they were talking about what they call shiny armpits in the apocalypse. And they gave the tagline, just because you live in fear for your life doesn't mean you let yourselves go, ladies. And explicitly, they call out some of the characters on the TV show The Walking Dead, a TV show that I must admit I'm a big fan of. But after I read this reading, now whenever I watch it, I am thinking about this, right? In an apocalypse, the fact that, you see people there with their hairless upper lips and their perfectly tweezed brows, and maybe most importantly, their armpits. And Rosita in this case is also for some reason rocking a crop top, where we also see that she has a very smooth belly. All of this is perpetuating this idea that women are naturally hairless. And anyone who is a woman or has a sister or a partner or a friend that they've lived with, or maybe even their mother, knows that this isn't the case, that for the vast majority of women, that perception of hairlessness is supported by tweezing and waxing and shaving, and even electrolysis requires multiple treatments. And it takes a lot of time, and it's time consuming, and it requires products, and it raises the question, would anyone necessarily not only have access to those products, but would that be a priority? Would that be how you are spending your time in the apocalypse? So when they still present these supposedly dystopian movies and TV shows, and these shows where the whole world is melting down and undergoing like a massive just kind of decline into, anarchy, whether it's caused by zombies or whatever, the fact that they still feature these women that are hairless and without body hair, it's like, why? Like, would that really be the case? And by putting it out there as the case, what message are we sending? The second example of the reading would be the history of Tom Cruise and his leading ladies. For people who don't know, and I know Tom Cruise isn't quite the same level of movie star, for most of you all the way he was when I was growing up. But Tom Cruise is short. He you know, is known to be short. Just how short he is up for debate. But that frequently means that a lot of his female co-stars and leading ladies are taller than him. And there are a variety of tactics in terms of how they frame the shots in his movies, as well as sometimes he's been in movies where he's worn lifts, which is basically like male heels, platforms. You know, how he used to position himself when he would be photographed with his much taller ex-wives, Nicole Kidman and Katie Holmes, or Nicole Kidman was significantly taller. Katie Holmes was also a little taller. You know, oftentimes they would be on a step, one or two below him. All of this, of course, was to continue to give off that perception that, especially in movies where he was being presented as the hero and the leading man, right? It's this idea that in order to be manly, you have to be tall. In order to save the girl, she needs to be shorter than you, because of this association that we have with, you know, masculinity and height and power and dominance. And how, as opposed to turning that dominant message on its head and being like, hey, Tom Cruise is all of those things. He's dominant, he's masculine, he's still the hero, but hey, he just so happens to be shorter than his leading lady. Instead of them just embracing that message, why instead they would go through all these tactics to, you know, make it seem like what was commonly known, Tom Cruise is short, was in fact not known in movie world. And the final example is when in MMA, and that oftentimes the one hard and fast rule in a very violent sport where almost anything goes is no hitting below the belt. And, you know, that part of the reading is especially interesting because, you know, they present that as if this is just, you know, a protection for men, but it's the same sport where, despite all that we know about concussions and CTE, we allow multiple blows to the head. So for some reason, why would we be more concerned about protecting men's genitals than their brains? And the authors of this particular reading said what it's really protecting about men is the idea, of course, that these, you know, strong, manly men that are engaging in this voluntary violence, right, that they're tough, that they're invincible. And that if we allowed crotch shots, and if, you know, I grew up with brothers, and, you know, so if you've ever hit a guy in that area, or if you're a guy and you've been hit in that area, you know that oftentimes it becomes a great equalizer, right? No matter how tough or dominant you are, you're not very tough and dominant when you're clutching at your groin and you go down really quickly. And the argument just being that no hitting below the belt rule isn't really so much about safety, but about protecting that image of that very specific image of kind of dominant, you know, toughness in regards to MMA fighters and their masculinity. And so, you know, all three of these examples, what they have in common is how media helps perpetuate this very kind of dominant definition of what is masculinity and what is femininity, and that these examples all contribute to the gender binary. Women can't be hairy in the apocalypse because men are hairy. Tom Cruise can't just be a short leading, action hero because we associate shortness with women, and not with men, especially leading, you know, the hero of the story. And then finally, that MMA in particular, which is kind of built on this image of toughness and violence, that hitting below the belt would quickly reveal that, you know, even the toughest guy, that there's, a pretty much a go-to method of kind of bringing the toughest guy to his knees, literally. And so all of these examples, this idea really is opening up this question about, you know, to what extent does this sex gender differentiation exist? Because commonly how people think about it and talk about it is that we're very different, and thus we are two sexes. And once again, it is this binary system. You're either XX or XY. You're either masculine or you're feminine. You're a man or you're a woman. You're a male body or female body. But it goes beyond just it being two. But for some people, their arguments is that it's not even just that we're different, but we are totally different. And one kind of popular author who kind of built on this idea of total difference is John Gray, who had the very popular book back in the day, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, right? It was the idea, and he would speak in his book about Martians, i.e. men, and Venetians, i.e. women. He'd speak about us as if we were two different species. And so the authors address this very early on in the chapter, by asking the question, are we opposite sexes? And, they first of all, they establish that this idea that we're opposite sexes is a fairly newer concept, because historically, males and females were seen as being the same sex, but women were seen as being the inferior version, right? And they give the quote that they used to think that women were just men inside out, right? But to the same thing that, the scrotum was made of, the vagina was made of, it was just internal. And of course, we now know that to be true as well. But the authors, their stance is, no, men and women are not the exact same. Women are not just inferior versions of the male body. But at the same time, we are not so different that we should be described as being the opposite sex. That there is not the evidence, the authors, state for that statement to be supported either. But oftentimes this is how we think of ourselves, right? We think of, that's what men do, or that's boys being boys, or, of course that she feels that way. She's a woman, right? We speak about ourselves in this binary term, as if by knowing your sex, we know your gender, and therefore we know everything it is about you, because males are so different from females, men are so different from women. And really a big part of this chapter is pushing back on this idea of the perfect binary. And they begin that pushing back, that complication of the binary, by addressing sex. Because even more so than gender, we're taught that sex is binary, right? You're born and you're XX, you're a girl, you're XY, you're a boy. And, and you get your X's from, your mom and your mother's eggs, and you get either an X or a Y from your father's sperm, and that's what determines your maleness and females. And we treat it like it is a perfect binary, but it is not. And so this is something that I introduced in the first chapter, but coming back to the fact that we have individuals in our society that are intersex, meaning that perfect binary, whether it's on the chromosomal level, or which is, XXXY, whether it's on the hormonal level, where people have, women generally have kind of one, or, kind of their own kind of unique combination of sex hormones, and men have their own different, unique combination of sex hormones. But people do not always fit those models. Then, we can talk about it in terms of genitalia, where, in terms of our sex organs, we think about women having uteruses and fallopian tubes and ovaries and vaginas, and men, of course, having testes and penises and so forth. But people who are intersex are people who deviate from that kind of binary norm. And they make up roughly 0.01% to 0.02% of the population. And there are a range of conditions that we would consider to be intersex. And some of them are immediately noticeable at birth. And some do not become noticeable until puberty. and some do not become noticeable for some women in particular until much later in life when they are perhaps trying to conceive. And so we don't talk about people being intersex, right? We don't talk about that being a third legitimate option. You finally have some states in the United States, and then there are some countries that now allow for a third option on birth certificates. But previously, how we used to treat and reinforce sex as being binary is that especially people that were identified as being intersex at birth, parents were oftentimes strongly encouraged, and in some cases, you might even want to use the words coerced, into choosing a sex for their child. And now, of course, we know that that kind of lack of bodily autonomy is really harmful. And there are laws that even in most states now protect against parents making that choice for their infants, allowing people to make that decision as an adult, if they want to identify, and particularly if they want to have, affirmation surgery, so that specifically in this case, so their genitalia presents as being non-deviant from that expected male and female bodiness. There is the Interface Project, which puts a public face on people with intersex bodies, because as I stated in the first video, that 0.01%, 0.02% is actually a whole lot of people if you think about all the people that exist in the world. And kind of the cute way to remember it is roughly the same percentage of the population globally who are natural redheads. So I like to tell some people, if you know a natural redhead or two, then whether you realize it or not, statistically speaking, you probably know someone who's intersex. I give you two clips from longer documentaries, and by all means, if you have the time to watch either documentary, Intersection or Gender Revolution, particularly Gender Revolution, it has a lot of things relevant to our course. But I give you two clips about how our acknowledgement that intersex people exist and the move we've done away from forcing people who are intersex to choose, right? They can choose, but like I said, we're now allowing individuals to do that for themselves instead of the expectation that their parents should make that decision for them. But in some cases, we're also respecting the fact that some people are rejecting the binary, that they're saying, hey, I was born intersex, and that's what I am. That's what I'm going to claim myself to be. Not male or female. And if your mind is still just kind of like blown, like you're really confused about how people can be intersex, and especially if you are maybe confusing or conflating it with transgender or gender fluidity or gender queerness, I strongly suggest that you take a nice long look at the steps towards becoming a man or a woman in the United States, that table 2.1, because up until you get to gender identity and gender expression, the last steps on the table, everything else are things that we think of as being biological, that maybe we've been taught that these biological aspects are inherently binary. But it's worth noting that there are many people who deviate from this kind of binary normative kind of path, as your book describes it. And this happens at each step. So your book talks in good detail about how people can deviate from that XY-XX chromosomal path, how if you're talking in terms of like gonads or external or internal genitalia, people can be missing one, they can have, genitalia internally that we would expect from both males and females. Particularly for males, external genitalia. If a person's, there is a measurement by which a penis has to be a certain length in order to be considered a penis, to be classified such as at birth. as opposed to it just then being labeled like a undistinguishable genitalia. There's the secondary sex characteristics that, for some people, this is when they realize they're intersex, when things do not necessarily come in, menstrual cycles don't happen, and secondary sex characteristics don't develop. And all of this, of course, is still talking about sex. We are not even necessarily talking about gender. So before we even move to talking about gender, it's just worth noting the binary is complicated even in terms of sex, that the 0.01, 0.02%, they have frequently been treated by the medical professionals as if they are mutations and anomalies. But when it is that large of a proportion, consistently that larger proportion of the population, it does raise the question, is it really their bodies that are the issue, or the kind of binary system that we have created to classify their bodies? So then we now start moving into talking about gender. So it's worth noting that part of why we think about the gender system as being binary is because we build upon the concept of sex as binary. Because we think about bodies as only taking two forms, male bodies and female bodies, then it allows us as a society to then construct these additional rules and expectations around those male bodies and female bodies. So the common expectation in society is that male-bodied persons should identify as boys, later as men, and then in terms of their behavior and expression, we refer to that as being masculine. And that female-bodied persons should identify as girls and women, then later women. And in terms of their behavior and expression, they should identify as feminine. So, masculine and feminine are the terms that we use when we are speaking about gender expression, while boys, men, girls, women, these are the cisgender terms that we use when we are talking about gender identity. And so, what's meant by masculine and feminine, right? So you might think of, what men wear versus women wear. You might think of accessories that we associate with and objects that we associate more with men and more than and some more with women. You might think about activities like cooking and cleaning versus repairing a car. So we have those types of we label those activities as being masculine or feminine. And then certainly personality characteristics can be labeled as more masculine or feminine. So some of the more masculine personality characteristics that you would think of would be things like brave and strong and stoic and rational, maybe violent or aggressive, athletic, right? All of those are terms that we might associate. Powerful. All of those might be terms that, are associated with masculinity. The terms that we might associate with femininity: nurturing, gentle, empathetic, beautiful, what are some other terms that we, domestic. All of those might be terms that we associate more with femininity. Now, it's worth noting that in any society, but particularly in a society like America that's multicultural, where we and is a vast society where we have different regions, right? There might be multiple models of masculinity and femininity in any society at a given time, let alone how the definitions might have changed over time, or how the definitions might differ, from society to society. So what I'm trying to kind of say here is that masculinity and femininity definitions in 2020 United States might be different than 2020 Sweden and 2020 Japan and 2020 Ghana and 2020 Honduras. At the same time, masculinity and femininity definitions in 2020 United States are different than the ones from 1950s United States and 1900s United States and 1775 United States. But also, the definitions of femininity and masculinity can differ within a given society at a time, right? So what Southerners see as being masculine in 2020 America might be different than what, people in New York and New Jersey define as being masculine versus what people in Texas define as being masculine, what people in California define as being masculine. Same thing with racial, ethnic, cultural groups, right? What it means to be a woman to someone who is Latina versus African American versus Korean American versus, white American of European descent. It is possible, right? That not only is it possible, we do have multiple masculinities and femininities in our society. However, at the same time, in every society, there is a dominant conception. It is the conception that we see most often in the media. It's the conception that usually, even if we don't fully agree with it, even if in some ways our own group or region might reject or tweak some parts of it, it is the dominant conception that even lives in our own minds because of the fact that it's the one that we think so many other people hold, the one that we maybe see reinforced in our media, in our schools, by our leadership. And currently, the two kind of models that we have traditionally had in America is hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity. Hegemonic masculinity, if you recognize that term, hegemony, it basically just means this is the dominant model of masculinity. It is when you say so-and-so's the man, or be a real man, or act like a man, that this is the model that most people are referencing in their mind when they say that. And emphasize femininity, well, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. With hegemonic masculinity, like I said, this is the model, whether the men in your life really are like this or not. This is the model that exists in our minds, right? It's a person that is athletic. It's a man who's successful. He is, tough and can do things outdoors. He's athletic. He's heroic. So he is, Tom Brady and Superman and Don Draper and Gaston from Beauty and the Beast, right? He is the Marlboro Man when he's a cowboy, and he's, the Terminator in terms of aggression and violence, and once again, being tough. And we'll come back to this when we get to our chapter on masculinity. But what is really important to emphasize right now is, obviously, this isn't who a lot of men are, but they get the message that this is maybe who they should be, or who women would want them to secretly be. And even if they aren't necessarily out there expecting to go to the NFL, it's this idea, I'm a man, I should know how to throw a football. Or, even if they know that, obviously they're not Superman and they can't fly and be faster than a speeding bullet, but it's the sense of, I should protect my lady, I should save the day. In the time of a crisis, I should be, I should take on this leadership role. It's this idea still of being successful in terms of career, and even if you aren't the sole breadwinner, maybe still even being the primary breadwinner. All of that is still just kind of wrapped in this dominant conception of masculinity. And this conception does still have a lot of strength and power in today's society. Even at the same time, we realize that a lot of men do not fit this model. Now, emphasize femininity. Now, if we were talking about, 30, 40 years ago, this model had a lot more public support back then. Nowadays, unlike hegemonic masculinity, where a lot of men maybe feel on some level that some of those traits they need to uphold to be a real man, emphasize femininity, the expectation you're supposed to be sexy, pretty, available, care about your appearance, that you should look a certain way in terms of wearing makeup and having long hair and being thin but curvy, that, you should be a domestic goddess and, know how to cook and clean and, take care of your man. in a lot of ways, and kind of especially post 1960s and 70s, and it's been picking up steam ever since with every generation that's come since then. The gender, the second wave and then later third wave of the feminist movement has kind of pushed women away from this being the dominant model for femininity. That's why we don't call this hegemonic femininity, because so many women reject so many parts of this, or they only uphold so many parts of this. But this is the image of femininity that lives in people's minds, right? For a lot of men, this might be still in the back of their minds the ideal woman. And for a lot of women, they might imagine for a lot of men that this is their ideal woman, even at the same time, even as they are making no moves to try to uphold it, right? So, they might be like, I wear sweatpants, I never wear makeup, and I can't even boil water. And they're okay with that. And they don't feel like it makes them less of a woman, but they might think that when people hear that, they think that it makes them less of a woman, because we still have this kind of special place, this, pedestal maybe might be a good word, in media in particular, for women that still uphold this emphasized femininity, right? That there is this nostalgia for this type of woman. But it's worth noting that our definitions of femininity have expanded with public support, social support, so that there are, in a lot of ways, there are many different ways in which one can be a woman and not have your womanness questioned. But the hegemonic masculinity model is still much stronger, and it's still much more ingrained in society. Ideas that we, like I said, we will come back to in this course. But for right now, just thinking to what extent you yourself describe yourself by using perhaps any stereotypical hegemonic masculinity, emphasize femininity terms, go back to your thought exercise and look at your list of your 5 traits. If you identify as a man, were any of the traits that you identified as masculine? If you identify as a woman, were any of your traits, all of your traits, feminine? I'm willing to bet that, especially in today's society, that for a lot of you, probably your list was a mix of traits that are masculine and feminine, and some traits that are maybe just gender neutral. And this idea that very few of us fit this kind of dominant conception, this dominant model of masculinity and femininity, is supported by a lot of research. But nevertheless, despite that, we believe that this binary exists. And, it's worth considering the questions that pop up on page 17. And it makes this point about, why are we clinging to this binary system when we know that this system does not work to classify everyone? When we are aware that there are 76 million people, whether you're talking in terms of their sex, their gender identity, or their gender expression, that don't fit this perfectly male or perfectly female body. And that it raises the question that if this many people are deviating in some way from the binary, is it really helpful to have the binary system? How do we decide who gets to count as a male, as a female, as a man, as a woman, when people can possibly deviate from our expectations, these binary expectations at each steps? And that last question about who cares, if bodies function but don't fit into the gender binary, is that really a problem, right? Because once again, if your body is functioning, if you have found a place, a role in society and people who love you, does it really matter if you are complicating the binary system? Like, why is that an issue? And I promise that that's a question that we will come back to at the end of this presentation. But what about all of us that are like, you know what? Okay, I get you, what you're saying, 76 million, but I'm not one of those. I'm not intersex. I'm positive that I check off all of those. I am on the normative path when it comes to chromosomes and hormones and internal and external genitalia. And when it comes to my gender identity, I identify as the gender that I identify as aligns with the sex that I was assigned with birth, i.e. I'm cisgender. And in terms of my gender expression, I more or less uphold what is expected of me in terms of my masculinity and or femininity. So what about the rest of those people, right? Because that is 90%, right? That is the vast majority of us. Are we opposite sexes then? So it's like, okay, if we throw out our outliers, if we throw out our anomalies, what about the rest of us? Aren't we very different? Well, let's look and consider some of the evidence. Last time we talked about height, and I did make the point that generally speaking within a given society, oftentimes men are taller on average than women, but there is that huge overlap. And then, as I emphasize, because height is genetic, if you then look at it globally, so we're talking about all men versus all women, then it becomes even more muddy because there are some countries that are very tall. And so the tall men are taller than the tall women, but then there are countries that are short, where the short men are taller than their short women, but they are shorter than that tall country's tall women. And then this just kind of throws a lot of our strong height correlate, height and sex correlate gets kind of thrown out the window there. We've already mentioned body hair. Yes, because men, secondary sex characteristic, when they develop testosterone, they undergo that second testosterone bath around puberty. That does lead to them being hairier. But once again, there are differences with race, different racial groups. There are some race ethnicities that are much hairier than others. And so once again, their men might be hairier than their not so hairy women, but their not so hairy men might be less hairy or equally as hairy as the women of racial ethnic groups that are hairier. Oh God, that was a tongue twister. I hope you followed me there. But all that's just to say, once again, there isn't this perfect like binary where, oh, you're hairy, you must be a male. You're not hairy, you must be a female. That in general, human beings, we're mammals, we are just pretty hairy. Something like breast, yes, generally speaking, women have breasts, men don't, but there is a condition where men develop breast. And of course, breast size in women is very variable. And then in general, as society has become larger in terms of their body fat percentage, this also has kind of muddied our distinction between, oh, you have breasts, you must be a female-bodied person versus a male-bodied person. Musculature, same thing really kind of as breast, once again, and height. Generally speaking, men have the ability, depending on genetics and hormones, so they have the ability to develop more muscles, but keyword there is develop, that if they do not, oftentimes if they don't act on this, if they don't actively develop it, they can be very slender, or like I said, especially in our society with the growing number of people at higher body fat percentages, they aren't muscular at all. And back when I used to manage a gym, there were always women that were very concerned about getting bulky. And admittedly, once again, there is a genetic element. Some women are more muscular than other women, but usually because of that lesser amount of testosterone, women have to really work hard and usually take some supplements to develop musculature. But once again, they can do it. So there still is not this perfect binary where if you see someone that has broad shoulders, that you can be like, oh yes, I can tell by those shoulders that you must be a male-bodied person, because there are men who don't have those shoulders and there are women who do. Check out the CrossFit Games. And then finally, reproductive abilities, right? So some people will be like, well, women are women, female bodies are distinct because they can bear children or they menstruate. And it's always worth noting, of course, once again, you're talking about the normative path, right? Thinking back to that table, but not all female bodies are able to menstruate, and not all are able to reproduce. Admittedly, of course, male bodies can't do either, but it's once again, it's not a all none statement, because not all female bodies can do it either, for a variety of reasons and conditions. And so then your book kind of makes this point that some of those perceived differences, particularly things maybe like related to body hair, breast, and musculature, some of them aren't as rooted in biology, but in behavior. And they refer to this as body work, right? That we work on our bodies in order to better fit the binary. And because so many of us are doing this body work, this helps reinforce and support the binary, because it makes us look more different than what we are. And this goes back to the shiny armpits and the apocalypse example, right? People think women aren't as hairy as they are because so many of us women, myself included, so don't think I'm attacking anyone here, but so many of us women work hard at body work to get rid of our body hair that helps align with this perception that we aren't really as hairy as we are. So, if you're one of the many, many women who spends time, money, energy, and effort shaving and waxing and using depilatory and getting electrolysis, right? All of which to give off this impression of course I don't have hair on my lip, or hairs that grow out of my chin, or hairs, on my arms or on my legs, right? It's not a natural biological difference. That difference of women aren't that hairy is rooted in behavior, right? Our decisions to remove body hair. Similarly, right, the idea that men are short-haired and women are long-haired. Well, and admittedly that's changing with all the men that are growing their hair out, to make man buns and ponytails and just long, luxurious waves and or dreads, right? This maybe isn't so much a belief as what it used to be, where you're thinking about in the 50s, where everybody maybe is rocking that crew cut or fade. But once again, that wasn't biology necessary so much as it was behavior. Men getting regular haircuts at the barber, and women being expected to grow their hair and keep their hair long. And so this body work, and your book makes the wonderful example about, we know that we can fake the body of the supposed opposite sex by looking at, drag kings and queens. And, certainly RuPaul, who's featured here on the slide, and the popularity of his show Drag Race. I mean, some of those drag queens are easily passable for females, that their hair, their makeup, how they exercise, how they wear corsets and wear heels, right? They have the ability to so perfectly mimic the female bodied aesthetic that people would just think that they are female bodies. And although drag kings are, I think, less well known, I give you an example of one in the upper right, it's the same thing, right? That same performative aspect. And we're about to talk about transgender here in a second. So while I'm on drag kings and drag queens, let me just emphasize part of what sets them apart from transgender, or people that we speak of as even being gender queer, gender fluid. Those are all identity terms. Drag kings and queens, it is often explicitly a performance. It's worth noting that RuPaul identifies as a man. In his case, he identifies, as a homosexual man, but that has nothing to do with his performance as a drag queen. That is a performance. And if you watch the show, you will know that this is a subject that has come up. And actually, I know I'm getting off track here, but I just find this interesting. It actually came up in a very controversial way a few years ago, when they had a transgender woman on there on the Drag Race, because it was like, okay, well, if you identify as a trans woman, that's different than the rest of the contestants who are doing this performative aspect, because in that contestant's case, it's like, this is an identity for you. And drag queens, by and large, identify as men, some homosexual men, some heterosexual men, because once again, sexual orientation has nothing to do with gender identity, and it also has nothing to do with a person's decision to be a drag king or queen. So your book, after introducing this concept of drag queens and kings, it pushes you to consider, yes, most of us aren't drag kings and queens, but we do what they call everyday drag, meaning we use our makeup and our hair choices and our workouts. And, if you've ever bought a waist trainer or taken flat tummy tea, but we do this body work to also better fit the binary. And they call this everyday drag, right? We are reinforcing the binary by going out of our way to try to look like this kind of ideal conception of, this is what male bodies look like, this is what female bodies look like. And so that just shows you that, as opposed to complicating the binary, that most of our decisions to kind of engage in body work and engage in everyday drag leads to a lot of us physically kind of reinforcing the binary. But what's interesting is that if we're thinking about it in terms of our behavior, right, our personalities, that is another kind of interesting observation, because although we talk about gender expression and identity as being binary, men are men, women are women, we're opposite sexes, we act different, we behave different, we want different things, whether that's due to biology or socialization, we ignore the fact that this just isn't true for most of us. There is this, what's called the law of the excluded middle. The idea that most of us, in a lot of behaviors, in a lot of traits, there is a lot of overlap between men and women. And what's really funny is that a lot of us know this about ourselves. So Wade and Faree, in their first edition, I didn't see it in the second edition, they give the concept called the personal exception theory of gender. The idea that we tend to think about other people as being very gendered, like, oh yeah, of course that's how Tom is, he's such a typical guy, or like, oh yeah, Brittany, I mean, she's just like every other girl. But then we think about our own selves as being the personal exception, right? We think about our own selves as being these complicated individuals, like, oh yes, I mean, I like this feminine things, but I also do this masculine things. I like to be girly some days, but I also really love sports, and I occasionally, and I love, my car, and a lot of women aren't like that. Whenever you start saying things, a lot of men aren't like that, or a lot of women aren't like me, you're engaging in this personal exception theory of gender. And like I said, that's really interesting, because what you are basically saying is you're forcing everyone else into this binary while acknowledging that you yourself are not part of the perfect binary. Now, Kimmel, who I think I mentioned before, I used to use his textbook in years prior, and I still reference some of his better ideas because I think some of them are interesting and add to the conversation. He has a slightly different take on the personal exception theory of gender. So he talks about what he calls cutting a deal. So he's like, society genders us appropriately with these dominant definitions, right? We see the dominant definitions maybe reflected in the cartoons we watch, the movies we watch, the music we consume, the ads that we see on TV and magazines, the articles that we read in magazines, the messages that we get from our parents, our peers, our teachers, right? Society makes sure that we understand the dominant gender definition. But then he says, in order for most of us to feel like our own authentic person, we then cut a deal with those dominant definitions. So what he means by cutting a deal is that we choose to uphold some parts of the definitions for our gender, and then we choose to ignore or reject other parts. And so this is what allows us to feel like our own self, our own unique little snowflake, special person. So we negotiate our gender identity and expression by kind of cutting these deals. And for most of us, we do this because we know that if we rejected it fully, that we would maybe be the target for gossip, teasing, ostracism, maybe even in some cases, depending on where you live and the time period you were living in, maybe even, violence. So most of us want to avoid those negative consequences. So instead, we find a way to cut a deal. So for me personally, my example normally, has a lot more relevance when you can see me in person, but I am very, very, very feminine in my presentation. I wear dresses almost every day. I love to wear high heels, and I pretty much always wear makeup. I'm very done. I dress in an overtly feminine way, probably 90% of the time. The joke with my friends is that I'm never dressed casual unless I'm in workout clothes, or like Kristen has like 2 things in her closet, a whole bunch of dresses and a whole bunch of Lululemon workout clothes. And that's kind of true. I cut that deal. I give off this overt femininity because my personality itself is pretty aggressive. I curse like a sailor. I don't back down for fights. In the fight or flight your response, my choice is always to fight. I push back. I'm argumentative. None of those are characteristics that are associated with femininity. They're the type of characteristics that when women are displaying those characteristics, people often call her a witch, except they substitute the W for a B. And certainly there are probably people that feel that way about me. What I personally have learned, what softens the blow and sometimes gives me a little space to be a little meaner than what people maybe would expect from a woman, is the fact that I am oftentimes dressed so pretty. So I am not dressed like the type of person that will aggressively tell you off. And so that sometimes means that I have a little bit more space and grace when I do that. So that is how I cut a deal. You yourself might cut other deals, like, maybe you are a guy and you really, like sports, even though you yourself are super unathletic, right? So you support athletics by being a fan, but you yourself are super unathletic and have no desire to be athletic yourself. Maybe you are a woman who maybe is the opposite of me, right? You're never in makeup. You're always wearing sweatpants, but you are super nice and nurturing and supportive, and personality-wise, all of those kind of stereotypical feminine things. Or, maybe you, the list can go on and on, right? There are a lot of examples of how people cut a deal. But if you take that cutting a deal and you combine it with the personal exception theory of gender, if everyone thinks that they're cutting a deal, but no one else is cutting a deal, and they are evaluating and judging other people in these strict binary terms, it just kind of supports, once again, why people often overlook the ways in which the 90%, the cisgender, male-bodied, female-bodied individuals are still not examples of there being a perfect binary. Instead, what we often think is that I'm going back in time because I skipped something along the way. Here we go. I skipped this. So it's because we often don't think about the ways in which that people who are, like I said, cisgender are also kind of complicating the binary, because they are, doing everyday drag, and they are cutting deals and thinking about themselves, personal exception theory of gender. We often are only looking at the people that fall in that kind of 10%, the people that are intersex, the people that are transgender or genderqueer or non-binary or gender fluid. And so your book talks about how these individuals complicate the binary because they are very clearly a rejection of kind of our expectations in terms of cisgender identity. So let's start off with transgender. And first of all, let me be clear that the appropriate term to use is transgender. You might see some old writings as you are researching things, or maybe you have even seen people still use this term if they're older, transsexual. And the reason why we don't use that term anymore, because transsexual was really focused a lot on people's genitalia, right? It was the idea that people wanted to change their biological sex, while transgender is a broader, more inclusive term because it acknowledges that what people are identifying with is gender identity and gender expression, that is not necessarily about genitalia. So, while I'm on here, it is oftentimes considered very bad form, to ask a person who's transgender about, what types of surgeries they've had. And that was the other issue with transsexual, is oftentimes there was just this very narrow-minded focus on surgery, right? Were you a pre-op or were you post-op? And of course, surgeries still exist today. They used to be called sex reassignment surgeries. Now you maybe are more likely to read them as what is called gender affirmation surgeries. And people can have top, bottom, full surgeries. Sometimes you hear the term fully transitioned. You hear discussion of hormone therapy. If you're talking about younger transgender individuals, you might hear reference to hormones that are referred to as puberty blockers, right? But in general, because transgender as a term is really much more focused on identity and expression, as opposed to transsexual, is not as much of a focus on this medicalization of these individuals. And same with the term gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria is the medical term that they use to diagnose people who have who do not feel that their identity aligns with their biologically assigned at birth or assigned at birth biological sex. In previous versions of the DMS, which measures psychological mental disorders, gender dysphoria has been listed as a mental disorder. Once again, I would say that this is something that we are moving away from. The medicalization of this identity is something that society is moving away from. Another trend to note in regards to gender identity expression, and we talked about this more in chapter 1, is this kind of expansion of terms in order to kind of give people the terminology with which to identify and express themselves. So, you hear terms like gender queer, non-binary, gender fluid. All of these represent identities that are rejecting that binary. All right, now going back to where I stopped before. And it's just worth noting, because you're like, that doesn't make any sense, rejecting the binary. We grew up in a society where the binary has been presented as being natural. The gender and sex binary is part of our society's ideology. And then you have the definition of ideology there. It's the set of ideas widely shared by members of a society that guides identities, behaviors, and institutions. So because we have this gender ideology, or gender is binary, sex is binary ideology in our society, it's hard to imagine that anything else can exist. But this is what I want you to take away from these pages of this chapter. No, I'm not going to ask you a bunch of questions about all of these different ideologies. But what I do want you to take away is that the gender binary is just one way of thinking about gender. It has become the dominant way of thinking about gender in societies, Western societies that have that embrace Judeo-Christianity, and a lot of it for people who are Jews or Christians. It comes out of that book of Genesis, and it says God created man and woman. When that is your origin story for your society, when that is that religious ideology that you embrace and believe, then obviously that's going to impact the gender classification system that you create. So when we look at anthropological evidence of other societies who do not have this binary view of gender, it's worth noting that a lot of these are societies that either never embrace Judeo-Christianity, or they received it very late from missionaries, and they already had this kind of non-binary gender system in place. And once again, I'm not going to go over all of these. I do find it very fascinating because I think sometimes because the binary has been such an established part of our gender ideology for so long in our society, people like to talk about this as if it's newfangled, as if it was created by radical liberals and the internet and the media. No. Like, when you have this much anthropological evidence of people and societies all over the world, across multiple time periods, that have had other ways of thinking and classifying, about classifying gender beyond the binary, then that really refutes the idea that this is a newfangled, based in, progressive radicalism that, it just popped up in the last 10 years. Because the American Indians have had people in their society that they refer to as two-spirited forever, and they were, and depending on whether or not it's man woman versus woman man, so they have they separate these two, and the Navajo have a fifth for gender fluid. Your book talks about in Hawaii and Polynesia, there are all these varied terms depending on the community, to kind of describe people that we would consider to be transgender and or gender fluid. They mention in India and Bangladesh, the Hira, and Brazil, the travestis, and in Mexico, or this community in Mexico, the mukes. All three of those represent men who are performing exaggerated femininity, and they are classified as being a third gender, and it's unrelated to sexual orientation, meaning they can be heterosexual or homosexual, so it's not like they're necessarily in same-sex relationships. Your book talks about all the places where gender is not tied to genitalia but to status, and other aspects, and in the Dominican Republic, they talk about, once again, how, and this was more in regards to sex than gender per se, because it's speaking about biological differences, but basically how this nutritional deficiency created and just genetics have created individuals there who people do not necessarily realize that they are women or they're girls until puberty. And they say that there's a similar phenomenon in Papua New Guinea. And then, of course, there's just temporary sex switching. I'm reading a wonderful book right now about the Basha Pash in Afghanistan, where biological girls are raised as a social boy. And that's just because of their patriarchal society. But then, of course, once they become adults, they're expected to become socially women. But in Albania, the Virginisha, they're allowed to remain socially they are allowed to remain men into adulthood, as long as they agree, that they're not going to marry. And this is not a super new phenomenon, because they said something very similar existed in the Dahomey Kingdom in Africa in the 1700s, where women could be warriors, but the agreement was is if you were going to be a warrior, then you were not to get married, right? You were not to occupy that space as wife or mother. And like I said, and I'm this is just photos that I found on the internet of examples of all of these, except for that top one, because if you're like, that looks like Wakanda and Black Panther. It is, but those characters in the movie, that all female fighting force, they were based on the women warriors of the Dahomey warriors. But all of these examples, it's not, like I said, about you remembering the individual details so much as it is about you just understanding that in societies that are not defined by Judeo-Christianity, a gender ideology that is not binary is actually quite normative. So I know it might seem unusual and out of the norm and not what we're used to in the US as we are expanding our kind of awareness of these different kind of gender classifications. But for a lot of the world, this is not as non-normative as we think it is. And that's because gender is socially constructed. It's the process by which we make reality meaningful through shared interpretation. And so because it's socially constructed, that means different societies can construct gender, their ideologies, their definitions in their own way, their own shape, form, and fashion. And so your book kind of makes this point. It's not just that we construct male bodies and female bodies and we label them as masculine and feminine, men and women, but we often layer objects, characteristics, behaviors, activities with these terms masculinity and femininity. We gender things. And we don't just gender things, right? I'm going to come back to gender binary glasses, but we divide and subdivide the binary. And that makes it even more complicated, right? So, it's not enough maybe to say, cars are for, that's masculine. But this type of car, I don't know, is feminine. I don't know, Hyundai Sonata. I'm just naming something off the top of my head. I guess it's stereotypical of me to not know a lot about cars, but I don't. The example your book gives is that dogs are seen as more masculine than cats, but some dogs are seen as being more masculine dogs than other dogs, like a pit bull would be a more masculine dog, while a Yorkshire Terrier would be a more female dog, a feminine dog. And your book talks about like a poodle's a feminine dog, but a larger poodle, a king poodle, is a more masculine of that version. So see what I mean about it getting complicated? So why do we do this, right? Why do we gender things? Why do we gender colors? Why do we gender activities? Your book makes the argument, we are brought up in this ideology that treats gender as binary, and we learn to put on these gender binary glasses, right? Where we are taught and expected to see the world in a gendered way. And we continue to do so, sometimes without even being fully aware, because it gives us cultural competence. It allows us to understand what is expected of us in our culture, what is expected of other people when we see things in this gendered fashion. It's kind of like a cognitive shortcut. And at the same time, it's something that allows us to increase cultural awareness, right? So, very quickly, little boys will pick up on they're not expected to play with dolls, right? That dolls are a gendered object in our society and it's not for little boys. And they'll pick up on that and they'll learn that by refusing and rejecting dolls, by displaying this cultural competence, that in a lot of settings that this is going to get them affirmation. If they were to play with dolls, if they weren't to look at dolls through the gender binary glasses, instead if they were just like, well, this toy seems fun and I want to play with it, then depending on the settings, they might receive condemnation from their parents, their siblings, their peers, maybe even their teachers. And so we just learn that it's easier for us in a society to do what society expects of us. It's easier and it's safer. And so by wearing the gender binary glasses, we are able to quickly or more easily decipher this is what's expected of us as men and women, to do masculine versus feminine things, to wear masculine versus feminine things, to buy masculine versus feminine things. Now, I talk about this as easy, but easy isn't the same thing as accurate or right. And so your book talks about how by wearing these gender glasses, it does result in blurred vision and blind spots, meaning it doesn't always allow us to see clearly, and it sometimes encourages us to miss some things completely. And it talks specifically about research that shows this is related to associative memory, right? How do we remember things? Like, we remember things in relation to one another. And there are tests for this. And I give you a link there to the implicit association test that's run by Harvard. So we associate things with being masculine, feminine, and neutral. And we tend to associate things with groups. And like I said, it's a cognitive shortcut. It supposedly allows us to think and register things more quickly, but it also can lead us to make mistakes. Your book specifically mentions that associative memory reinforces stereotypes and possibly causes us to overlook when we are seeing non-stereotypical behavior. So they say that we are more likely to forget when we see people and see things that are not reinforcing our associative memory. So you might say something like, well, in my experience, women just aren't funny. Well, if that's the kind of stereotype that you're rolling with, you might implicitly, subconsciously be forgetting all the women you've maybe met that are funny, or the times that you've seen women make a joke and it's made you smile, made you laugh. And instead, you remember more, you're more likely to remember the memories that align with your stereotype, right? So you think more about all the male comedians that you've laughed at, or all your male friends that have cracked jokes and you've laughed. And once again, a lot of this, the research suggests, is happening on the subconscious level, right? So it's not like this is something you're purposefully trying to do, but it's like a file system, and we create files for categories that we expect to use more often. We don't create files for categories that we don't expect to use. So we kind of go throughout the world, sometimes in regards to gender, continuing to collect examples that kind of align with our stereotype, and ignoring, not paying attention, not necessarily seeing the examples that don't align with our stereotype. And so for people that are just interested in these kind of just kind of neurological kind of basis of gender binary, and what we notice and what we don't notice, we'll be coming back to this in a little bit more detail in next week's chapter 3. And so this is the final point, right? We're going to return to an idea from chapter 1. Once again, no one's saying that difference doesn't exist at all, but it's overstated. We're definitely not opposite sexes, and we are definitely not from different planets. Not only are we from the same planet, we are probably from, the same county in nearby towns, right? We just aren't that different. Not our male bodies versus female bodies, and not men and women in terms of their actual behavior and characteristics. So it begs the question, and this is the question that came up in chapter 1, why do we overstate the differences between men and women? What are the consequences of that? And a lot of that does have to do with power. who has it, who doesn't have it, who wants to keep it, and how this then relates to structural systematic inequalities. That if we believe that women are more emotional, then maybe it allows us to be less likely to support them for public office. If we believe that women are naturally more nurturing, then it might explain, why we don't encourage more men to be stay-at-home dads, even when financially that might make a lot more sense for their families, or why in family courts, men are much less likely to get sole custody or even joint custody of their children if custody is in contention. There is that kind of relationship between overstated difference and these systems of inequality that relate to who has power in society and who doesn't. And so the question that's posed at the end of chapter 2, if we don't learn the idea of the gender binary by observing the people around us, where does this idea come from? Right? So that's what I really want you to kind of take a moment to consider. If you really stopped and took a hard look at people and pushed past the personal exception theory, what you probably would see is that a lot of people are cutting deals. And if you really stopped and thought about a lot of our bodies, then you'd realize that without body work, a lot of us are not vastly different outside of, like I said, our genitalia. And then if you stop to consider the sizable minority of people who are intersex, who are transgendered or gender fluid, or some other form of non-binary that rejects the binary, then it once again just raises this question of, and this was the question that I pulled from page 17, who cares? Like, who does this binary system serve? And that is going to be an idea that we continue to explore in this class. And that is it for this video.